This is just for folks who couldn't make it to the presentation today. So I'll share my screen too for slide deck. All right, that's my email. All right, there we go. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my slides now. Hide my video here. Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar today on adapting and creating OER. My name is Mahrya Burnett, and I'm a scholarly communications librarian at Main Library on campus. Although, like many of you, I've been working from home this year. This is kind of meant as a bit of a follow-up to last week's webinar. I did see some folks that were in that webinar last week. This is kind of meant as a follow-up, but if you haven't seen last week's webinar, that's fine. They're kind of separate but related topics, I guess. So what I'd like to really focus on today is taking a closer look at what to do if you want to use OER, but there isn't existing resources available that you can use out of the box. And that's actually pretty common, I think. Folks will find material, but it maybe isn't quite what they need. You know, it requires some adaptation, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. And then we'll switch gears to talking about how to actually create OER if there isn't a lot of source material available at all. So this is maybe review for some of you, but I just kind of want to make sure we're on the same page about what open educational resources are. So they're basically teaching, learning, and research resources that are free of cost and access barriers and also carry legal permissions for open use. So these are things like open textbooks, but also supplementary resources as well. They're free for students. Usually they're accessed through the internet without any sort of like paywall or any kind of account creation necessary. And they're also legally permissible to be used. And so that can happen in several different ways. You could use works that are already in the public domain or works that aren't subject to copyright because they're created you know, by a government entity. Or what most people actually use is OER that's been licensed under Creative Commons licensing for the intention of open use. So we'll talk a little bit about Creative Commons licensing and some of the special implications for different Creative Commons licenses that come into play when you're doing an adaptation. So yeah, I do want to kind of just introduce that concept. Okay, so adapting OER. When you might want to consider adapting or remixing a work is when the existing resources don't really meet your needs exactly, but they come pretty close, right? So this is like when you might find 2 or 3 sources that seem like they could be potentially kind of woven together or integrated into a book, but they would need some work to be able to do that. Also, when licensing allows for it, we'll talk about that. When you have a decent collection of source material, so this could be things that you find in OER repositories, things that you've been teaching with for years. You know, this also just includes things that you've created yourself as well. Things like lecture notes, you know, your PowerPoints, all the materials, right, that you would use to teach your course can potentially be sort of reworked into an OER. And then this last thing is kind of important too. Adapting and remixing OER takes more time than it does just to find existing works. And it takes more time than, you know, using commercial textbooks, obviously. So you have to make sure you kind of carve out enough time for it and that you have the resources and skills to do so. The skills part, you know, the skills are easily pretty learnable, but they're just, you know, things that you have to kind of acclimate yourself to before you're ready to embark on an adaptation project. I do want to quickly show this slide. This will be familiar to any of you who attended last week's webinar. You will want to try to do some pretty in-depth searching for source material before you embark on an adaptation project or an OER creation project. And these are some of the big repositories where you can find different types of OER. And as I mentioned in last week's webinar, you know, the nature of OER publishing is such that, you know, you can find sometimes books in multiple repositories, but other times, you know, you might have to kind of search through these different sources before you find what you're looking for. I will put these slides on the OpenHawks website in case you're interested in seeing these slides after the presentation, but you can also just kind of jot down or remember some of these repository names too. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about copyright and how it kind of relates to all of this. So Title 17 of the US Code, Section 106 is the section that dictates copyright in the US. And it says that the owner of copyright has the exclusive rights to do the following things or to authorize others to do the following things. Reproduce the work, prepare derivatives, distribute copies, publicly perform or display a work, or digitally transmit sound recordings. So one thing to keep in mind here is that when we're talking about works, right, we're basically talking about anything that you've created or that somebody's created that kind of exists in a fixed and tangible form. So a lot of people think that in order for you to get copyright to something, you have to register your copyright with the US Copyright Office or put the little symbol on your work. You don't actually have to do that in order to obtain a copyright. Anytime you create something and it's somehow fixed, right? So that could be textually, it could be a piece of writing, it could be a recording, that thing belongs to the creator and they have the exclusive rights to do all these things. Now, a lot of times people who are interested in getting their work published will actually transfer their entire copyright over to their publisher, who then has the sole right to do all of these things. But other times people will keep their copyright and grant licenses to different entities, whether that's individuals or publishers, in order to do some of these things on an exclusive or a non-exclusive basis. So that's where Creative Commons licensing comes in. I don't know how many of you have heard of Creative Commons before, but it may be, if you're totally new to the idea of Creative Commons licensing, you might want to, after the webinar, just take a look at their website and kind of familiarize yourself with the different licenses that they offer. But essentially what Creative Commons does is it provides these 7 licenses over here. You wouldn't know that these are licenses by these abstract little symbols, but we'll kind of talk about what all the symbols mean in just a second. But essentially what Creative Commons licenses allow you to do is kind of affix these little symbols along with kind of a statement of attribution on any work that you create. And then these symbols kind of tell the reader or the potential user of your work what they can and can't do with it. And it has these sort of symbols which are sort of meant to be like the human readable layer. And then when you see these licenses in the wild, they'll also be accompanied by a link that will take you into the license itself. And there's also kind of a machine readable component there too, so that like Google and other search engines can kind of parse search results based on the licensing as well. So I do want to spend a few minutes kind of talking about these different licenses and what they allow you or don't allow you to do. So up at the top here, we have these 3 licenses: the public domain license, which is sometimes called the CC0 license, the CC BY license, and the CC BY share alike. And what these licenses allow you to do is to share the work with others. So, you could share this OER, say, that you're using with your students. You could transmit it over email or post it on Icon. Then you can also remix it. And that's what Creative Commons calls adaptation. So for our purposes today, adaptation and remixing are kind of synonyms. And what that allows you to do is make any updates to the text. So if you find factual errors, you can correct them. If there's some local examples or local context you wanted to add to a work, you could do that. If there's several pieces of content, several different OERs that you'd want to mix together into one work, you could do that. And a lot of people might not be aware of this, but it also allows you to use the work commercially. So this is maybe, it seems a little strange, but you could actually take an existing OER, make some adaptations to it, and put it behind your own paywall. And people do that sometimes. Educational technology companies will harvest OER and sometimes put it behind a proprietary reading system or add some kind of improvements to the OER and then sell it. And so that is actually allowed under these types of licenses. So the CC0 license basically tells the reader, this work is in the public domain. You don't even have to cite me as the source. I'm giving this work up and I have no say in how it's used anymore. The CC BY license, you actually do retain your copyright, but you're telling your users, you don't really have to check with me. You can just cite this work as mine, and then you can do whatever you want with it. The share alike license, or the share alike kind of component that's added to this, says, yeah, you can go ahead and do whatever you want with this work, but any kind of downstream use, any kind of derivative that you make, you have to also share under this exact same license. And this kind of prevents people downstream from putting like more restrictive licenses on any derivatives. So that's kind of the most open category. Then underneath that, we have these other licenses that have a no commercial clause. And so that means, yes, you can share it, yes, you can remix it, but those commercial uses that I was just talking about are not allowed under this license. And so there's the CC BY NC license and then the share alike version, which just like this tells the reader that any sort of downstream use of this also has to be licensed under the same the same license. And then finally under here, we have the more restrictive no derivatives licenses. And these allow you to share the work with students. You can post it on icons, email it to them, whatever, but you can't alter it in any way, right? So you can't make those corrections that you see that needed, or you can't make any sort of derivative based on that work. So for the purposes of adaptation, those licenses are not allowed, right? So if you find something really great, or pretty great, I guess, and maybe it needs some updates, and you'd love to do that, but it's published under a no derivatives license, unfortunately, you can't really use it. Another thing to keep in mind is that with these share alike licenses, say you have two pieces of source material that you'd really love to use. Maybe one of them is licensed under a CC BY SA, and the other is licensed under a CC BY NC SA. So these are two different licenses that are incompatible, right? And so you can't actually use these incompatible licenses as part of an adaptation or remix. So that's a little tricky too. But one thing to keep in mind, though, is that not every reuse of a work is considered an adaptation in the eyes of the law. And so this is where things do get a little trickier. I don't want to get too far off in the weeds today, but I do kind of want to mention that there are differences between what's considered an adaptation and a collection. And these two pictures I borrowed from my colleague over at Hardin Library, Heather Healy, who is kind of our resident expert in Creative Commons licensing. So I would, if you know Heather or go to Hardin ever, I would, suggest that you contact her about any questions you have with OER or with Creative Commons licensing. But anyway, these pictures come from her, and she's sort of uses eggs as a metaphor, right? So she says that a collection is essentially like this basket of eggs, right? You have all of these things, they're together for a reason, we don't really know what that reason is by looking at the picture, but they represent kind of a whole, right? A basket full of eggs in a collection. But at any point you could take out any one of those eggs and it would still be an egg, right? You could still separate the original parts from the whole. Whereas an adaptation is more like an omelet. And that's kind of where all the components are mixed together in such a way that they can't be taken back apart. And I think Creative Commons as an organization does a pretty good job of explaining this. And I'm going to read just a short passage from their instruction materials on adaptations versus remixes. Okay, so this is a quote. In many situations, such as the reuse of a photo in a slide presentation, it's obvious that no adaptation has been created. However, the determination can be more difficult when bringing together multiple works into one larger work. This distinction between adaptations and collections is one of the trickiest concepts in copyright law. It also varies by jurisdiction, and even within a given jurisdiction, a judge's determination between the two can be subjective, since there are few definitive rules on which to rely. In contrast to an adaptation or remix of others' work, a collection involves the assembly of separate and independent creative works into a collective whole. A collection is not an adaptation. One community member likened the difference between adaptations and collections to smoothies and TV dinners, respectively. So now we're really mixing our metaphors here, but I think that is also like a pretty apt distinction, right? So a collection, and then here's yet another definition we have from the US Code, the copyright portion of our law, says that a collective work is a work in which a number of contributions constituting separate and independent works in themselves are assembled into a collective whole. So they mentioned the example of like a PowerPoint presentation with a bunch of images that you put in, but I would also say something like an edited volume, like a scholarly work where each chapter is kind of authored by someone else would be another example of a collection. And so for purposes of licensing, I think this graphic does kind of a nice job of kind of explaining the difference. So we have this TV dinner, which is kind of disgusting to look at. I'm sorry about the lurid quality of this image, but anyway, each component is sort of licensed under its own CC BY license. So we can kind of pretend that these are all source materials that we might want to use in a collection, right? We can see our meat here is licensed under CC BY. And then we have, I don't know, apple cake or something over here that's been licensed under a CC BY NC share alike. We've got something here that's a CC BY no derivatives, and then we have a CC BY share alike. So if this was an adaptation, this use would not be allowed, right? Because the Ps are telling us we have to put our new adaptation under this license, and the apple cake is telling us we need to publish it under this license. And our little guy in the middle here is saying that we can't actually do adaptations at all because it's got this no derivatives clause. So, this wouldn't work if we were mixing all of these together into one dish, right? But because we're keeping all of the components separate, how you would actually deal with this in the wild, if you had, pieces of content that you were trying to sort of integrate into a collection, would be to make sure that each piece remains separate and that each Creative Commons license is affixed to the piece in question. So if it's an image, just put it in your image tag. If it's a piece of text, put it in your endnotes and just make sure that each license is very clearly labeled. So the US Code talks about derivative works thusly. It says an adaptation is a work consisting of editorial revisions, annotations, elaborations, or other modification, which as a whole represent an original work of authorship. That's a derivative work. So a derivative work is kind of a synonym for an adaptation. And in this case, we've got our smoothie here, right? And I apologize for the kind of blurry nature of this image. I wasn't able to find a better one. But you can see here, we've got the smoothie, right? You can't unblend that smoothie. But we can look at the constituent parts here and tell whether or not they're compatible, right? So we've got our public domain strawberries here. That's fine. Our CC BY pineapple, which is again fine. And then our CC BY now commercial bananas, which can't, all of these three are compatible so far. But our oranges here, these are licensed under a CC BY NC share alike license, which means that any derivative work has to be licensed under that. And so that's why our smoothie here bears that license. Now, what would happen, do you think, if these bananas, instead of being published under a CC BY NC license, were published under a CC BY NC SA license? Does anybody want to unmute and kind of weigh in on what we would do in that case? Well, in that case, we would not, well, actually, okay, that was a bad example because that would be the same license as the oranges and would be fine. But let's say we were actually, let's go back and say that actually it's the pineapple that has the share alike clause added to it. So we got a CC BY and share alike, and we've got a CC BY and C share alike. In that case, we could not use both of these ingredients in our smoothie, right? We would have to take one out. And, that's just kind of the nature of these licenses, right? You have to really sort of follow the intent of what the author, intended by applying those licenses. Okay, so I know that that was a lot of kind of considerations, a lot of nuts and bolts about Creative Commons licensing. If that's not all crystal clear right now, it doesn't really have to be. I would just say, as you're kind of going with your adaptation, you'll really want to kind of become more familiar with the licenses and what they entail. Some other considerations though, how much content will actually need to be changed? Will you be rewriting whole chapters? Will you just be sort of making more cosmetic changes? All of that will really depend on how much time you need to allot. You need to look at the format of the original work and make sure you can actually edit it. Some documents are easier to edit than others, depending on how they were created. And then things like multimedia resources are more difficult to edit, right? Because they're sort of more, it's hard to take apart and edit a video, right? And then finally, how will students interact with the content? In what format will you publish it? Will it be integrated into Icon? You want to try to kind of think about best practices in keeping the work as open as possible. So you don't want to take like a very open format, such as like LibreOffice or something, and put it in a more restrictive format. You want to try to keep it as open as possible. But then also students really appreciate it when work is integrated into Icon and they don't actually have to go out to a separate platform or separate place to access it. So, another thing to consider is whether or not you'll integrate the work into Icon. So those are some things to kind of think about when you're adapting OER. I do want to switch gears soon and talk about creating OER, but before I do that, I want to make sure that we don't have any questions about anything we've covered so far. So if you do, just feel free to jump in. You can jump in at any time, really. But if nobody has any questions right now, we can kind of go into talking a little about creating OER. Okay, so when might you create your own OER? When source material is limited or non-existent. So what we saw with adaptation was like, there's a lot of source material I could use here, but it's not quite ready to use. When you might consider creating your own OER is when the material really is limited or doesn't exist. But you do need to have sort of an existing content base that you're going to borrow from, when when you're reading or when you're writing. And that existing content base, again, might just be what you know from, your expertise in teaching the class and your training and your education and things like that. Those might all, be contributing factors that will sort of build your content base. Also, when you have significant time and financial support. So we looked at, with adaptation, you need to kind of give some consideration to your skills and time, but when you're creating OER, you really need to kind of give significant time to the project. The university does offer some financial support through the Open Hawks grants program. I don't know how many of you on the call today are interested in applying for that funding, but it is a good way to sort of get some help with creating these projects, right? And that financial support can be used to, hire collaborators or to purchase software or to sort of compensate your own time as well. And so that can be helpful. Also, if you're interested in open pedagogy or sort of having students really actively participate in building authentic assignments and authentic, learning resources, you might want to consider creating your own OER. It fits very nicely in with the concept of open pedagogy. So, for instance, we have a couple projects right now at the university where professors are working with students to actually write textbooks. And both of the projects I'm thinking of now have been very successful. They kind of follow different models. One of them has former students as the authors, they're being compensated, and that work looks really great. And then the other one, the instructor has sort of written the bare bones of the textbook, but then she's actually having her students in class edit it, add their own examples, contribute to it, and just sort of build off the base. And so both of those models, I think, are really awesome, and I love seeing that. Another thing to consider when you're creating your OER is how people are going to be able to edit it and work with it if they want to make derivatives of your work, or even just edit it for their own purposes. So one framework we kind of work with in OER is the ALMS framework, which has been around for a while, since 2010. And it uses this acronym to kind of talk about the editability of the OER that you create. And some of these might seem kind of duplicative, and you might wonder, like, what's the difference between some of these? But they all kind of have to do with different types of editability. So the first one, access to editing tools. So you want to be able to offer the OER in a format that can be easily edited using tools that people normally have, right? So that might be something like just OpenOffice or LibreOffice, something that everybody could access and edit just online. Some things like PDFs require you to have like a PDF editor, that's, a bit more of a lift, but not undoable for most people. And then, level two, or number two, is looking at the level. So this is the format requirements in terms of technical expertise. So what you're trying to do is make sure that it's not going to take a lot of technical expertise to revise your work. And this is also kind of discipline specific. I think, in some disciplines, technical expertise is just sort of assumed, like computer science, for instance. But in others, you really want to make sure people who want to edit your work down the line shouldn't have to involve their IT department necessarily, right? Again, meaningfully editable. This is offered in an editable format, which might, again, seem pretty duplicative with one, but really one is more focused on the editing tools. 3 is more focused on the resource itself. Is the resource itself in a format that can be edited? They give an example in the ALMS framework of like a scanned PDF being very much not meaningfully editable because you can't, work with that content very easily. And then 4, this is talking about the source file that may actually accompany the work. Sometimes, depending on what you're writing, these might be one and the same, right? Like if it's an HTML file, for instance, they would be sort of inseparable in some ways. But certain types of OER will also require you to work with the source file, and you want to make sure that that's also editable and accessible for everyone. Okay, I've included a link to a short video here that I'd like us all to watch. This comes from my colleague, Abby Elder in Iowa State. And she, for those of you who haven't seen these videos yet, they are great. She has all these different ones on different topics pertaining to OER. This one's about tips for new creators. So I'd like to just watch the video and then we can kind of talk about it.
Welcome to this week's video. Today's video is going to cover 5 tips for instructors who are considering creating an open educational resource for the first time. First, you need to consider what course objectives you want your OER to meet. According to a 2016 study of faculty using OER in their courses, there are 4 major considerations that instructors have to consider when implementing OER: the effectiveness of the material, the efficiency of using the material, the appeal of the resource over traditional methods, and extension, or the material's ability to extend the learning opportunities and accessibility. This study looks into the usefulness of OER that have already been created, but it works when considering a new project as well. Before you begin to create a new resource, consider how effective it will be in your course, whether its use will improve or enhance student learning in some way, and whether it will be usable and useful outside of your course as well. This is an open resource, which means it has to be somewhat customizable for other learning environments. The second facet to consider when creating an OER is whether you already have a resource that could be expanded upon or made open as is. Open educational resources aren't just textbooks. They're also lecture slides, notes, quizzes, lesson plans, lecture recordings, and so much more. Think about it. You can edit course notes that you've been using for years into a textbook chapter, or you can openly license and share instructional videos online. Look around at what you have already. If you've been teaching for a few years, chances are you have some materials you've developed that you can make into something great. But let's move on to something bigger now. What tool or tools do you use to create your resource? This is a pretty big question, and it will depend on the type of resource you're creating, but there's one rule of thumb I'd recommend. Consider using tools you already know. Tools like Google Docs and Microsoft Word can be great starting points for writing open texts, and there are online tools you can import these texts into for sharing later on, if you'd like to update them or share them in a more accessible format. But what are some specialized tools you could use if you really wanted to learn something new? One tool commonly used to create open textbooks is Pressbooks. Pressbooks is an online book publishing platform built on the same foundation as WordPress. Because of this, Pressbooks is remarkably easy to use and offers some great features like themes for structuring the display of your books and an easy-to-use interface for organizing book chapters and sections. However, it is important to note that Pressbooks is only free up to a point. Added features like the ability to clone existing books to edit them or exporting your books into EPUB format are only available for paid versions of the platform. Another tool you can use to create your own OER is the Open Author tool from OER Commons. Unlike Pressbooks, all of OER Commons tools are completely free to use, and you have the ability to share outside resources and web pages on OER Commons as well. When you're creating a new resource in the OER Commons interface, you get this simple-looking screen with basic features like headings, subheadings, and the ability to put images or special characters into your text. However, OER Commons doesn't have a lot of advanced features for displaying your work, so you can't do as much with your design as you might on more advanced platforms. There are a lot of other platforms you can use to create OER as well, especially if you're creating an audio or video resource. So I'll link to a few lists of these creation tools in the description. The fourth consideration you need to take into account when you're planning to create an open educational resource is the open license you'll be assigning to your resource. The most common type of open license attached to an open educational resource, Creative Commons licenses, come in 6 basic types, and each license allows users to have certain permissions when reusing a resource. Before you put out a new OER, it's important that you consider what rights you want to retain over your resource and what rights you want to allow users to have. For example, do you want users to be able to update your resource or edit it? These considerations will affect what license you give your resource once it's been created. Finally, the last consideration you need to take into account before you create an open educational resource is where and how you'll be sharing it. If you're wondering where to deposit your resource, just browse around. Look at OER repositories like OER Commons and the Open Textbook Library, media sharing sites like YouTube for video resources, and see if your learning management system has a process for sharing OER in its interface, like through Canvas Commons. If you want to keep your resources nearby, ask your institutional digital repository if they can host your content as well. There are a lot of options to choose from, and you can even host your resource on multiple sites. But remember, if you share your resource on multiple sites, you'll also need to update it on each of them as well. Consider how you'll address these concerns before posting your resource everywhere. Creating an OER for the first time can be pretty scary, but open educational resources can be a lot of things, and you may already have the tools and foundation you need to make something great. You don't need to run into this unprepared. Think about how, where, and why you're creating this resource before you begin. And as always, contact your librarian or check out our library guide if you have any questions.
All right. Hopefully you guys found that helpful. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of show that video to reiterate a few things just about, you know, time and about determining whether or not something's going to meet your needs. But also, I do want to talk about a little bit about, you know, some of the things that Abby talked about in terms of considering, you know, your license that you want to apply and where you want to share your work. So just like we looked at with adapting, we were kind of trying to see what kind of source material we could use together based on the licenses that they were published under. When you're creating OER, you have to kind of think of it from, you know, your author's perspective and what you want to share, whether or not you want people to be able to edit your work. But then you also kind of have to think about it from the perspective of somebody who's trying to use your work downstream and how easy that's going to be. So, so I would give some consideration to, you know, what license you want to apply. For Open Hawks funding, we do, you know, we don't require that you use a certain license, but we really try to strongly encourage applicants to make their works as open and shareable as possible. Also, and then deciding like how to share your OER. You can do that in any number of ways, but through the University of Iowa, through the Open Hawks program, we sort of have a workflow where finished OER goes right into our institutional repository. So she mentioned their institutional repository from Iowa State, but we have one too here at University of Iowa. And what we do for the funded projects is that we require all of the projects to go into our institutional repository, and, you know, if edits and updates and things need to be made, they can be made there. And then all of the other repositories and things, we set it up so that they kind of point back to our institutional repository, so you don't have to keep making those edits in all of the different places. So those are kind of some of the broader considerations. I did want to include this slide about some of the different authoring tools that we have available to us. Abby mentioned Pressbooks. We do, in fact, have a site license for Pressbooks through University of Iowa, which gives you the full functionality of the software, meaning you can import and clone content. You can also, there's lots of different outputs and formats you can work with. And in terms of the way it kind of looks and feels, it does look very much like an ebook that you would sort of see commercially published. You know, it has nice fonts, nice, you know, layout and things like that. In terms of it, you know, how difficult it is to use, if you've used WordPress before, it's very similar to WordPress. It's actually built on the WordPress platform. For those of you who've used Icon, it's actually, you know, like the text editor is kind of what you would be used to seeing on like a learning management system, maybe a little more involved, but not a ton. Also, she had mentioned, you know, writing your content in any of these word processing tools, and that's totally fine. In fact, that's what most people do, I think, is kind of start writing their content, you know, just in Word, and then you can move it over to another platform when you're done. You know, LibreOffice is the most open of these three platforms because it doesn't require you to have, you know, Microsoft Word access or Google access. One thing to kind of keep in mind with Word, I don't know if you've ever tried to develop text in Word and then copy it over to another place, but they have all sorts of hidden HTML and coding and things in Word. So I would always suggest that after you draft content in Word, you run it through like Notepad to kind of strip out all that excess formatting. And then there's something like Inkscape, which is really good for creating editable PDFs and also includes some, you know, vector drawing and graphics capabilities. So it looks really nice. A little maybe more technologically advanced than Pressbooks. The OER Commons open author platform, just as Abby said, it's very slick and easy because you can kind of create the OER and then publish it in the same platform. But the text editor is rather rudimentary. So there's not like H5P integration possible, or it's really hard to kind of embed multimedia with OER Commons. And then there's something like Gitbook, which I've never actually used, but I've heard good things about it. It runs off of the GitHub platform. So if you're already developing projects in GitHub, you can actually just, I think, kind of like export it fairly easily to a Gitbook. There are tons of other, you know, platforms and editing tools as well. So I would just suggest, you know, that you kind of familiarize yourself with a series of them and then just decide which one's going to work best for you. Okay, so questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can talk about, you know, any aspects of the presentation that you'd like to. Oops. Anybody have any questions?
I have one.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jess.
Okay. When you talk about like the licensing in the communal commons space, is that something that the creator of the new resource chooses which one of those they want? Okay, they do.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of like, it's just what they want to retain in their rights of like creating the new thing? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
How does that get decided?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to decide. I mean, you really have to kind of give it some thought in terms of how you want people to use your work downstream. So it's like, you know, if you really just want people to be able to do whatever they want with as little hassle as possible, SEC BY license is the way to go for that, I think. But, you know, there are considerations around the idea of commercial use. And I mean, personally, my thoughts on that have really sort of changed in recent years because I have seen educational technology companies like taking open content and putting it behind a paywall. And, you know, I find that kind of unsavory unless they're really adding some kind of value to it. There are instances though, where they're adding a lot of value to it. And so, you know, there are people who have seen their OERs really sort of take off because they've had this like commercial company working with them. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really up to you in terms of whether or not you want that kind of engagement or whether you want to, you know, include that share alike clause in your license, because that can really keep people from taking your work and making it more restrictive, you know, with their iterations. However, you know, as we saw with the adaptation content, it is really hard if some people are trying to work with multiple sources at the same time. And if they have licenses that are incompatible, it can make it kind of tricky, right? Any other questions? Sorry, go ahead. So is anybody planning on applying for Open Hawks funding? I guess maybe we could talk a little bit about that too, since I know maybe some people are interested. Andrew, it looks like, okay. So do you have any questions about that, about how, you know, how adapting or creating OER kind of fits in with that grant proposal project?
I haven't really looked at the all of the guidelines for the grant yet, but I have a co-teacher in this large business law class, and we're both going to be working on applying for the grant to adapt. We found a couple of examples that we think we kind of want to synthesize, and then we have some original material as well. So we're hoping to apply to fund a research assistant, hopefully this summer, with the goal of even using it next fall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
that sounds like a pretty good plan, you know, and a lot of our applicants kind of have that model that they're working with where they have some source material, probably some original content. I think the challenge with that application will be to decide, because we have all these different grants you can apply for, and the level of funding kind of depends on what you're doing. And so I could see that project being either a remixing grant or, here, let me pull up our Open Hawks website real quick, just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. Oops. So we have these different types of awards. And so for something where you're taking existing content and kind of weaving it together, that would be a remixing grant. But if you're doing a lot of the writing yourself, that would be more like an OER creation grant. So, you know, deciding which one to apply for can be kind of tricky, especially if you don't quite know yet exactly like how much, you know, content you're going to actually be writing versus kind of adapting.
yeah, I think our first move will be to apply for the remixing grant, and then, you know, hopefully there's not like a one-time limit on these, because some of the things that we're doing, we've developed some 3D virtual reality models that we want to incorporate in the text, and then we're shooting a lot of kind of fun videos and things that we hope to do more of when the pandemic is more under control. So there may be a point where we, you know, come back and apply again to do those things, but we're just kind of looking to get something on the books for this fall and try it out, see how it goes. And I think the students are going to love it, because the #1 textbook in our discipline costs $306.
Oh my goodness.
And they're just not going to use it again. Most people only take one law course in business school or their whole life, and then they're done with it. So
yeah. Well, I think that would make your proposal pretty competitive. That's one of the things we look at is, you know, the cost of the current textbook and how much money be saving students, you know, over the long term. That's not everything we look at, but it is kind of a big component of it. And as far as applying for repeating funding, we do have people do that. And in fact, you know, we kind of went back and forth on whether we would allow that, but what we're finding is that a lot of these projects are very much like starting small and building out a base, you know, like maybe you have a sequence of courses and you've, you know, developed an OER for the first course in the sequence and you want to build on that and do the second course in the sequence. And we're finding like, we want to reward that behavior, you know, and really sort of establish good OER practices within departments. And so, yeah, you can definitely apply for awards like 2 years in a row. Although I will mention, this is officially our last round of funding. So the grant comes as part of the Provost Innovation Fund, and it's like a 3-year pilot. And this is our last round, but we're really hopeful that we'll, because this has been pretty successful so far, we're really hopeful we'll be able to get continuing funding either at the university level or through external grants.
I have a question about hosting the materials in the repository. So we had started working on a press book, and I found that the HTML5, not the H5P modules in Pressbooks don't really allow as much customization as I want.
Mm-hmm.
So I have some software where I can make HTML5 content that I can embed in there, but I need somewhere to host it. And if I wanted to make that an open access resource, I guess, is there a way to do that where it would be hosted on a website in the library, but like linked within the Pressbook? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that might be something we could do. So we've found like there are several projects that have different hosting needs, and we do have some server space in the libraries for that. But so yeah, I think that the short answer, yeah, I think that would be something we could probably work out. Yeah, so then the actual Pressbook would be sort of like hosted on the Pressbook site and platform. And then from Iowa Research Online, what we do is we have a link to that, you know, so that you can go out, access the resource on Pressbooks, but then we also include an upload of the PDF, and we also archive a copy of it. So we want as much as possible to get every little bit of media that is sort of included in these OERs archived, which has been a challenge. And so, yeah, so one of the things that we've done to kind of work around that challenge is to host some of these things locally. And I think I do have to talk to our web folks, our IT folks in the library, just to make sure that we still have that capability. Because I know it was a bit of a stretch last semester, but I think as more of these projects get published, we'll continue to offer that in some capacity, the hosting element.
Okay, thank you. And I can send you an email as to what program I'm using, if that would be helpful for them to answer the questions.
Yeah, that might be really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Any other questions? Okay, well, we can wrap up early. If you think of anything after the webinar, you can feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be putting the recordings for all these under training materials. It's kind of a strange label, but this is where I'll be putting the links to the slides and the recording. It looks like we got a question in the chat. Oh, you're welcome. All right, well, if nobody has any questions, I will, I'll stop the recording and end the meeting, but yeah, feel free to let me know if you have any. All right, see you guys later.